The last voicemail Deborah Vang left was for her sister. It was recorded at 6:48 p.m. On March 11, 2005, from the parking lot of the Cub Foods on County Road 42 in Burnsville, Minnesota, the message was 47 seconds long. Deborah said she was stopping for groceries on the way home, that she'd pick up the soup ingredients her sister had asked for, and that she'd call back after dinner. Her voice was ordinary, unhurried, the kind of voice that belongs to a person who believes they will be home in 40 minutes. She did not call back after dinner. She was never home again. And the voicemail, saved by her sister on a Nokia phone, then transferred file by file through 3 subsequent phone upgrades across 19 years, would eventually become the most important piece of evidence in a case that the Dakota County Sheriff's Office had spent 2 decades believing they understood and did not. That is not a story about a woman who vanished without warning. That is a story about a man who had been standing close enough to Deborah Vang's life that he could make a plan around it, who knew her schedule, her route, her habits, and who had constructed, with deliberate care, the appearance of an explanation that was not the truth. And it would take 19 years, a digital audio forensics laboratory in St. Paul, a retired detective who kept a whiteboard in his garage with the case laid out in dry erase marker that his wife had asked him repeatedly to remove, and a single ambient sound in the background of a 47-second voicemail to take that explanation apart. But before any of that, we have to go back to Burnsville. Because to understand what was done to Deborah Vang, you first have to understand who she was and what her life looked like in the winter of 2005. Burnsville in 2005 was a first-ring suburb south of Minneapolis, the kind of place that existed in the particular American geography between the city and the country, where the big box stores lined the arterial roads and the neighborhoods behind them were quiet and deliberately maintained, with basketball hoops in the driveways and minivans in the garages, and in March, the particular gray-brown exhaustion of a Minnesota winter that has gone on 2 months too long and has not yet given any sign of ending. It was not a place people wrote poems about. It was a place people lived in because it had good schools and manageable mortgages and was 40 minutes from the airport. The Vang family had come to Minnesota from Laos by way of a refugee camp in Thailand, arriving in the Twin Cities in 1981 when Deborah was 3 years old. Her parents, Boa and May Vang, had settled first in St. Paul and then moved to Burnsville in 1993, when the schools and the space had seemed worth the commute. There was a substantial Hmong community in the southern suburbs by then, families who had made the same calculation, who had built a particular kind of Dakota County life that held both the old ways and the new ones simultaneously, in the way that immigrant communities do when they are serious about belonging without disappearing. Deborah was 27 years old in 2005. She worked as an administrative coordinator at a medical device company in Aiken, a job she had been in for 4 years and that she was good at in the specific way of someone who is organized by disposition rather than by effort. She managed 11 people's schedules, 3 conference rooms, and a supply ordering system that she had personally rebuilt from scratch when she started, because the previous one was, in her words, to her sister Linda, a disaster held together by sticky notes and hope. She drove a silver Honda Car-V. She went to the Cub Foods on County Road 42 because it was on the way home, and because she had been going there long enough that she knew which checkout lanes were fastest. She was engaged to a man named Kevin Thau, whom she had met at a New Year's party in 2002, and who worked as an electrician in the Southern Metro. They had been looking at houses in Apple Valley. They had a date in July. She had already bought the dress. Her sister Linda lived 12 minutes away and called her 3 times a week, and the 47 seconds of that parking lot voicemail soup ingredients, call you after dinner, was so entirely ordinary that Linda would later describe listening to it in the weeks after Deborah disappeared as one of the most painful things she had ever done. Because it sounded like nothing. It sounded like a Tuesday. It sounded like a life that was going to continue past that parking lot and that 47 seconds, and into the unremarkable evening it was supposed to be. On the morning of March 12, 2005, Kevin Thau called Linda to ask if Deborah had stayed at her place. She had not. By noon, they had called the Burnsville Police Department. By 3 p.m., a missing persons report had been filed. By 4 p.m., the silver Honda Kia RV had been found, locked and empty, in the northeast corner of the Cub Foods parking lot, where Deborah had called from the night before. The groceries were never found. She had never gone inside. At 4:22 p.m. on March 12th, the first officers to respond to the parking lot noted that the CRV was locked and positioned normally, without any sign of external damage or disturbance. The driver's seat was adjusted to Deborah's height. Her work badge was on the center console. Her gym bag was in the cargo area. There was no purse, no phone, no keys. Whatever had happened in that parking lot had happened to her before she went inside, and it ended with someone locking the car behind her. A Dakota County Sheriff's detective named Phil Sundstrom was assigned the case the following morning. He was 46 years old, 20 years on the job, and he had worked 2 prior abductions in the county. Both resolved within days. He brought that experience to the Vang case, and he brought his full attention. He canvassed the parking lot and the surrounding businesses. He obtained security footage from the Cub Foods, the adjacent strip mall, and the gas station across County Road 42. He interviewed every employee who had worked that evening. He built a timeline from available footage that placed Deborah's Kia RV arriving in the parking lot at 6:44 p.m. and established that by 7:02 p.m., 18 minutes after she arrived, the space around the Kia RV had been vacated by a second vehicle that had been parked adjacent to it. The second vehicle was a dark blue Chevrolet Silverado pickup. The footage was poor, a 2005 parking lot camera at low resolution, but it was enough to establish the vehicle type and a partial plate. Sundstrom ran the partial. It produced 11 candidates in Dakota County alone. He worked through them systematically. One candidate was a man named Scott Reimers. Scott Reimers was 34 years old in 2005. He lived in Lakeville, 8 miles from the Cub Foods. He worked as a licensed contractor, remodeling, additions, finished carpentry, and he had, for the preceding 14 months, been doing work at the medical device company in Aiken where Deborah was employed. He had replaced the flooring in the administrative suite. He had built out a new conference room. He had been in and out of Deborah's workplace for over a year. He knew her name. He knew her face. He knew what car she drove, because he had parked next to the silver Kia RV in the company lot enough times to have remarked on it to a coworker. He owned a dark blue Chevrolet Silverado. His plate was among the 11 candidates. Sundstrom interviewed Reimers on March 16th, 4 days after Deborah disappeared. Reimers was cooperative, easy in his manner, the kind of person who answers questions in complete sentences and makes eye contact in the way that can read as either confidence or practiced performance, depending on what you already know about someone. He said he had not been at the Cub Foods on County Road 42 on the evening of March 11th. He said he had been at a job site in Farmington until 5:30 p.m. and had then driven home to Lakeville. His wife confirmed he had been home by 6:30 p.m. His wife's confirmation placed him home 18 minutes before the Cub Foods parking lot footage showed the Silverado arriving. Sundstrom noted the math and said nothing. The plate match remained inconclusive, The partial on the footage was consistent with Reimers's plate, but not exclusive to it. Without Deborah, without a body, without additional physical evidence, Sundstrom had a circumstantial picture that was suggestive and unprovable. He kept Reimers on his list. He pursued other leads. He pursued them for 3 years, and then 2 more, and the case did not break, and Scott Reimers remained on the list and on the street, and in his marriage and in his business. And Sundstrom retired in 2014 with the Vong case, the one file he did not know how to put down. He built a whiteboard in his garage. By 2010, 5 years after Deborah disappeared, Kevin Thau had moved to Chicago for work. He had sold the engagement ring after 2 years because he had not known what else to do with it, and had felt guilty about selling it ever since. Linda Vang had become a nurse at Fairview Ridges in Burnsville and drove past the Cub Foods on County Road 42 twice a day, every day, for 19 years. Because she lived on the other side of it, and there was no other route that made sense. She had developed the particular skill of not looking at the northeast corner of the parking lot. She had not always succeeded at it. Boa and May Vong, Deborah's parents, had never moved from the house in Burnsville. They kept Deborah's room the way it had been in 2005. The dress she had bought for the July wedding was in a box in the closet. Boa Vong died in 2018 without knowing. May continued to make the soup Deborah had been going to buy the ingredients for on the anniversary of her disappearance every year, because she had decided that making it was a way of completing something that had been interrupted. Deborah Vang was listed in the Dakota County Missing Persons Database. Her file photo appeared on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Adults database. A Facebook group maintained by Linda had 2,300 members. Phil Sundstrom's whiteboard in his garage in Apple Valley had not changed since 2016. The name in the center of it, connected by dry erase lines to the partial plate, the parking lot footage, the employment records, the wife's timeline, and 12 other notations, was Scott Reimers. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, building timelines, tracking records, finding the people who never stopped looking. If this kind of work matters to you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. And now, let's get back to Deborah. Then, in the spring of 2023, a digital audio forensics analyst named Yolanda Marsh was working through a backlog of cold case audio evidence for the Dakota County Sheriff's Office when she received a request to examine a voicemail file in the Vang case. The request had come from a newly assigned cold case investigator named Troy Wickman, who had been working through Phil Sundstrom's retired case files at Sundstrom's invitation, and who had pulled the voicemail as part of a comprehensive evidence review. The voicemail was 47 seconds long. Deborah's voice was clear and ordinary for the first 40 seconds. In the final 7 seconds, after she said she would call back after dinner, as she was lowering the phone, there was background sound. In 2005, the detectives who had listened to it had heard what sounded like wind or traffic, consistent with a parking lot in March. Yolanda Marsh had access to tools that did not exist in 2005. She ran the audio through a spectral analysis program used in broadcast forensics. She isolated the ambient layer. She identified, beneath what had registered as ambient noise, a sequence of tones, a backup alarm, distinctive in its cadence and frequency, from a commercial vehicle reversing. Behind that, barely audible but present, a male voice, close to the phone's microphone, saying 4 words. She had the audio cleaned and enhanced 3 times by 2 additional analysts. All 3 confirmed the same 4 words. She called Troy Wickman on a Thursday afternoon and played him the enhanced clip over the phone. He listened twice. Then he said, Pull Scott Reimers again. What the enhanced audio established was not, on its own, a conviction. What it established was that someone had been standing close to Deborah Vong in that parking lot at 6:48 p.m. on March 11, 2005, close enough for his voice to register on her phone's microphone while she was recording, and that this person had spoken 4 words that were identified by 2 forensic linguists brought in by the prosecution as consistent in cadence, vocabulary, and regional phonetic markers, with speech patterns documented in recorded interviews with Scott Reimers. It was not the only thing. Over the following 6 months, Troy Wickman and Yolanda Marsh, working with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, built a case from evidence that had been present since 2005 and never fully assembled. Forensic genealogy analysis of biological trace evidence recovered from the Kia RV's door handle, swabbed in 2005 and stored at the BCA, returned a match to Reimers's family line. A court-ordered DNA sample confirmed the match. Cell tower data from March 11, 2005, reanalyzed using current methodology, placed Reimers's phone in the area of the Cub Foods parking lot between 6:41 and 7:09 p.m., a timeline that overlapped precisely with the parking lot security footage. His wife's alibi, he was home by 6:30 p.m., was re-examined. She was interviewed again, 19 years later, separated from Reimers after a divorce in 2017. She said, in a statement she signed and swore to, that she had not been certain of the time, that she had told the detective what Scott had told her to say. She had been afraid in 2005 and had told herself it was probably nothing, and had spent 19 years deciding what to do with what she knew, and had decided that enough was enough. On November 14, 2023, Scott Reimers was arrested at his apartment in Lakeville. He was 53 years old and had been divorced for 6 years and was running the contracting business under a different name. The agents who came to the door that morning said he looked, for just a moment, as if he had known they were coming. Not surprised, only finished waiting. He was placed under arrest without incident. He said nothing. Linda Vang was at work when Troy Wickman called her. She stepped out of the nurse's station and walked to a quiet end of the hallway and stood there with her back to the wall and listened to everything Wickman said. When he finished, she asked him to say the name again. He said it. She had known that name. Sundstrom had told her that name, carefully, years ago, in the way that detectives tell families what they believe without what they can prove. She had carried it for years, known and unprovable, like a splinter too deep to reach. Scott Reimers was tried in Dakota County in the fall of 2024. The prosecution centered on the voice in the voicemail, the cell tower data, the DNA match from the door handle, and the testimony of his former wife. The defense challenged each element. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Reimers showed no reaction. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Deborah Vong's remains have never been found. The sentence was handed down without a body, without a location, without whatever answers Scott Reimers has chosen to keep. He has not offered them. The Vang family's attorney stated after the verdict that the family had asked Reimers, through counsel, to tell them where Deborah was. He had not responded. May Vang was in the courtroom for the verdict. She was 71 years old and had driven herself to the courthouse in Hastings and had sat in the front row with Linda on one side of her and Kevin Thau, who had flown in from Chicago, on the other. When the verdict was read, she closed her eyes. She sat that way for a moment. Then she opened them and looked at the man who had taken her daughter, who had said nothing to her and would give her nothing, and she turned away from him to her remaining daughter and put her hand on Linda's face the way a mother does when a child is the thing she needs to hold, and did not look at him again. Phil Sundstrom drove from Apple Valley to the courthouse that morning. He sat in the gallery. He had taken the whiteboard down from his garage wall the week before Wickman called to tell him about the voicemail. He had not been ready to take it down then. He had been ready by the time the trial started. After the verdict, he went home to Apple Valley and called his wife into the garage, which was clean for the first time in 9 years, and said nothing that either of them has reported publicly, because some things are not for reporting. A 47-second voicemail, saved through 3 phone upgrades across 19 years, solved this case. Not the forensics alone. Not the cell tower data alone. Not the former wife's statement alone. The thing that reopened it. The thing that gave Troy Wickman the reason to pull the audio and give it to Yolanda Marsh and ask her to look at it with tools that did not exist in 2005, was the systematic, patient review of evidence that a retired detective had cataloged on a whiteboard in his garage, and that a cold case investigator had taken seriously enough to work through from the beginning. Evidence does not expire. Audio does not expire. The ambient sound at the end of a parking lot voicemail in 2005 was always there. The voice in that sound was always there. It waited for the technology to read it and for someone to ask the right question of it. That is the thing about cold cases that this story demonstrates more clearly than most. The evidence is often not the problem. The problem is finding the question that makes the evidence speak. Deborah Vang was 27 years old. She was reorganizing a filing system and planning a wedding and calling her sister about soup ingredients. She drove a silver CR-V and knew which checkout lanes at the Cub Foods were fastest and was building a life in Burnsville that was ordinary in the specific, deliberate way of someone who has decided what they want and is getting it done. She had 47 seconds of her voice left, and her sister saved it through 3 phone upgrades, and it was enough. What do you think it says about the way we handle digital evidence that a voicemail from 2005 was never subjected to spectral analysis until 2023, and that this was not an oversight, just a technology gap? Is a conviction for first-degree murder, without a body, without a location, without Scott Reimers ever saying a word, is that justice for May Vang and Linda Vang and Kevin Thau? Or is it something incomplete that the law cannot fully close? And what does it mean that the break in this case came from a retired detective's garage whiteboard that nobody but Phil Sundstrom ever thought was worth maintaining? Justice came for Deborah Vang after 19 years. Her voice is still in that voicemail. Her family kept it. Stories like hers are why this channel exists, because the things people keep and the questions people refuse to stop asking are where the truth hides until it is ready to be found. Subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.